Sometimes the people who hurt you most are the ones who share your blood. Elena Morgan learned that lesson the hard way at 37, sitting in a leather chair worth 3 months of her teaching salary, watching her siblings divide their grandmother's estate like vultures picking at bones. But that morning started differently. It started with cold. The Honda's windows had frosted over during the night, turning the Walmart parking lot into a blur of sodium lights and delivery trucks. Elena woke at 5:30 to the familiar ache in her lower back, the one that came from sleeping in a driver's seat for the 207th night in a row. 7 months. They'd been homeless for 7 months, and her body kept precise count of every uncomfortable hour. She turned carefully, checking the back seat. Sophie slept under 3 winter coats, her 9-year-old face peaceful in a way that broke Elena's heart every morning. The girl had adapted to this life with the resilience that felt both miraculous and wrong. No child should know how to sleep in a car. No child should wake up and immediately check if anyone had noticed them parked there overnight. Elena's phone read 5:32. The store opened at 6. They had 28 minutes to look like they'd just arrived for early shopping, not like they'd spent another night in the lot. She reached for her wallet in the cup holder and counted. $23.47. The math was simple and brutal. $12 for gas to get to work and back for 3 days. That left $11.47 for food. Peanut butter sandwiches again. Maybe apples if they were on sale. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Elena almost ignored it, but at this hour, unknown numbers usually meant bad news or bill collectors, and she'd learned that bad news didn't improve with waiting. The voice on the other end was professionally gentle, the kind of tone lawyers practice for delivering information that would change lives. Frederick Patterson from Patterson and Associates. Her grandmother Margaret had passed away 3 days ago. The funeral had been yesterday, which Elena had missed because she didn't have gas money to drive to Denver from the suburb where she'd been teaching. The will would be read Monday morning at 10. Elena's hands shook. She lowered the phone and pressed her forehead against the steering wheel, fighting the sob that threatened to escape. Maggie had been the only family member who'd called after David left. The only one who'd said, maybe this isn't your fault, when the divorce lawyer explained that Elena's teaching salary meant she couldn't fight for the house. The only one who hadn't said, I told you so, when Elena admitted she was sleeping in her car. And Elena hadn't seen her in 8 months because gas costs money and pride costs more. Sophie stirred in the back seat. Her small voice cut through the pre-dawn darkness with the kind of knowing that children of crisis develop too young. Is it Grandma Maggie? Elena turned, wiping her eyes before her daughter could see. But Sophie was already sitting up, already reading her mother's face with that terrible perceptiveness. The funeral was yesterday, baby. I'm sorry, I didn't know. Sophie's chin trembled, but she pressed her lips together. 9 years old and already practicing the art of swallowing grief so your mother doesn't crack. Elena wanted to scream at the universe for teaching her daughter this skill. There's a will reading on Monday. The lawyer says Grandma left instructions. Specific things she wanted us to have. The hope that flickered in Sophie's eyes made Elena's chest tighten. She knew what her daughter was thinking, what Elena herself was thinking. Maybe enough for an apartment deposit. Maybe enough for first and last month's rent. Maybe enough to stop sleeping in parking lots and pretending this was an adventure. We should get ready for school. Early bird catches the worm, right? Sophie nodded and started folding the coats with practiced efficiency. They had a routine. Elena would walk Sophie to the Walmart bathroom where they'd wash up in the sink, brush teeth, change clothes from the plastic bins in the trunk. Then McDonald's for dollar menu breakfast if they could afford it, or the protein bars from the glove compartment if they couldn't. Today was a protein bar day. The memory hit Elena without warning, sharp enough to steal breath. 6 months ago, not even 6 months. Daniel's voice on the phone when Elena had finally broken down and called her brother for help. You made your choices, Elena. Teaching art to teenagers doesn't pay bills. I can't enable poor life decisions. She'd asked for $2,000. Enough for an apartment deposit and 1 month's rent. Enough to give Sophie a bedroom and a door that locked. Daniel had a Tesla and a penthouse downtown. Catherine drove a Maserati. But Elena's request for help had been enabling poor decisions. The gym opened at 5:30 on weekdays. Elena had maintained her $29 membership for one reason only, and it wasn't fitness. The showers were clean and private and had hot water that didn't run out after 5 minutes. They arrived at 5:45, Elena carrying a backpack with their towels and clean clothes, Sophie holding her school uniform in a careful bundle. The teenager at the front desk barely looked up from her phone. Elena and Sophie headed straight for the women's locker room, where they'd perfected the art of looking like they belonged. Quick showers efficient. Elena stood under the spray and let herself have 30 seconds of something close to luxury, feeling the heat work into her perpetually tense shoulders. When they emerged, Sophie looked like any other fourth grader heading to St. Catherine's Elementary. Navy jumper, white polo shirt, hair in neat braids. The uniform was 2 years old and the hem had been let out twice, but it was clean. Elena had made sure of that. Whatever else fell apart, Sophie's uniform stayed pristine. Elena's own clothes were Target clearance rack, 3 years old and wearing thin at the knees, but professional enough for teaching. She'd learned to tie scarves in ways that disguised the fraying collar of her one good blouse. Art teacher chic, she joked to herself in better days. Now it was just survival. They drove in silence to St. Catherine's, where Elena dropped Sophie at the early drop-off program. The hug lasted 5 seconds longer than usual. Sophie squeezed hard enough that Elena felt it in her ribs. "I love you, Mom. Love you more, baby." Then Elena drove across town to Henderson High, where she taught Introduction to Studio Art to teenagers who mostly cared more about their phones than perspective drawing. She parked in the teacher's lot and walked through the morning show with her lesson plans and her grandmother's death sitting heavy in her chest. The other teachers in the break room were discussing weekend plans. Elena poured coffee from the communal pot and nodded along, contributing nothing. Sarah from English asked if Elena was okay. She looked tired. Elena smiled and blamed allergies and escaped to her classroom, where she could be alone with her thoughts and her grief and the suffocating weight of another day pretending everything was fine. Her students filed in at 7:50, 23 juniors who ranged from genuinely interested in art to deeply asleep. Elena launched into her lesson on value scales, demonstrating shading techniques, while her mind wandered to Monday morning and Frederick Patterson's professionally gentle voice, and the wild, desperate hope that maybe Maggie had left something that would change their lives. Monday arrived with unseasonable cold. Elena had cashed her bi-weekly paycheck on Friday afternoon. $2,180 direct deposit. By Monday morning, $900 had gone to the storage unit where everything they owned sat in a 10 by 10 space. $420 to car insurance. $250 to the minimum payment on credit cards she'd maxed out during the divorce. That left $610 for the entire month. Gas, food, Sophie's lunch money, phone bill, gym membership, and the constant terrifying knowledge that one car repair would destroy them. She'd taken $120 for this trip. Gas to Denver and back, with enough left over for the camping supplies they'd need if Maggie had actually left them the mountain property everyone said was worthless. The law office occupied the 8th floor of a building downtown that screamed money in every brass fixture and polished marble tile. Elena and Sophie rode the elevator in silence, both dressed in their best. Elena's one funeral-appropriate dress, Sophie's uniform, because it was the nicest thing she owned. The receptionist directed them to a conference room that could have held Elena's entire classroom. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city, a table that probably cost more than Elena made in a year. Leather chairs that whispered expense. Frederick Patterson was already there, arranging papers with the careful precision of a man who'd done this too many times to be moved by the grief it caused. He looked up as Elena entered, and something in his eyes softened. "Miss Morgan, thank you for coming. Please sit." Elena and Sophie took seats on one side of the massive table. Patterson poured water from a crystal pitcher into glasses that probably cost $50 each. Elena's mouth was desert dry, but she couldn't bring herself to drink. Not yet, not until she knew. "Are we waiting for Daniel and Catherine?" "They should be here shortly. Can I get you anything, coffee?" "There are pastries in the break room." "We're fine, thank you." Sophie's hand found Elena's under the table, small fingers squeezing tight. Elena squeezed back and tried to project a confidence she absolutely did not feel. The door opened at 10:05. Daniel arrived first, phone pressed to his ear, barely acknowledging Elena's presence. He dressed for this the way he dressed for board meetings. Tom Ford suit that probably cost $3,000. Apple Watch Ultra catching the light. Hair perfectly styled in that way that required a $200 monthly maintenance plan. He ended his call and dropped into a chair across from Elena without greeting her. Just a quick glance and then back to his phone. Elena could see the Tesla app open. He was checking something about his car from 8 floors up while their grandmother's will waited to be read. Catherine swept in at 10:10, bringing the scent of expensive perfume and the energy of someone who billed by the quarter hour. Maserati keys in hand, Hermes briefcase that Elena recognized from a magazine article about Catherine making partner at Crawford and Associates. She'd worn a Cartier watch to their grandmother's funeral. Elena remembered because she'd stared at it during the brief phone call where Catherine had mentioned the service was happening but hadn't actually invited Elena to attend. Catherine's eyes swept over Elena and Sophie with an assessment that took approximately 1 second. Target dress-worn shoes, the unmistakable markers of struggle. Something flickered in her expression that might have been pity or might have been satisfaction. Either way, it made Elena's skin crawl. Shall we begin? Patterson's voice carried the gentle firmness of a man trying to keep this professional. Daniel set his phone face down on the table. Catherine opened a leather notepad and clicked a pen that probably cost more than Elena's grocery budget. Both of them looked at Patterson with the focused attention of people waiting to learn how much richer they were about to become. Patterson cleared his throat and began reading in the flat legal tone that made even death sound like a contract negotiation. Margaret Elizabeth Stone, being of sound mind and body, had executed her will on March 3rd of the previous year. There were small bequests to various charities. $15,000 to the Denver Art Initiative, $5,000 to the Copperfield Public Library. Another $10,000 split between the local food bank and women's shelter. Daniel shifted impatiently. Catherine made a note. Elena felt Sophie press closer against her side. To my grandson, Daniel Morgan, briefly leave the property located at 2847 Cherry Hills Drive, including all structures, furnishings, and landscaping. Daniel nodded. Elena knew that address. Lakefront house probably worth $1.4 million at current market rates. Daniel's expression didn't change. He'd expected this. To my granddaughter, Catherine Morgan Hayes, I leave my complete collection of antique jade pieces professionally appraised at $950,000, as well as my vintage jewelry collection appraised at $180,000. Catherine made another note. Efficient clinical, like she was tallying up a business deal not receiving her grandmother's estate. Patterson paused. His eyes found Elena's with something that looked like apology. To my granddaughter, Elena Morgan, I leave the sum of $5 in cash in the original mountain homestead located at Copper Ridge, Colorado. GPS coordinates and property deed to be provided separately. The silence that followed had weight and shape. It pressed down on the room like a physical thing. Elena felt it in her chest, in her throat, in the sudden heat rising to her face. Then Daniel laughed. It wasn't a chuckle or a quiet expression of disbelief. It was a full, genuine laugh that echoed off the conference room walls and seemed to go on forever. His head tilted back. His shoulders shook. The sound of it made Elena's vision narrow to pinpoints. $5. Daniel could barely get the words out. $5. That's it? Catherine wasn't laughing, but her lips had curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. More like satisfaction at being proven right about something. The old mountain shack. God, that place hasn't been occupied in 40 years. The structure is probably condemned by now. Daniel was still laughing, wiping his eyes. Elena, I'm sorry, but this is almost funny. $5. I spend more than that on coffee. Catherine's voice cut through with surgical precision. Though perhaps proportional to life contributions, Daniel built a $50 million tech company. I made partner at Crawford. You draw pictures with teenagers for $37,000 a year. The words landed like physical blows. Elena's hands clenched under the table, but she kept her face still. 7 months sleeping in a car had taught her how to take hits without flinching, how to let cruelty wash over her without giving the satisfaction of a reaction. Sophie's hand squeezed harder. Elena squeezed back. We're okay, the pressure said. We've survived worse than this. Patterson cleared his throat. Mrs. Stone left specific instructions regarding the mountain property. She requested that Elena visit the site personally before making any decisions about disposition. Disposition means getting rid of it, Catherine said, in case legal terminology is unfamiliar. Daniel leaned back in his chair, still grinning. What's to decide? The place is worthless. Not even worth the property taxes. You'd have to pay to keep it. Actually, the property taxes are current and paid through the end of the year. Patterson's voice carried a hint of steel. And there are no liens or encumbrances. The 40 acres are fully yours, Miss Morgan. 40 acres of rocks and a collapsing cabin, Daniel said. Congratulations, little sister. You're officially a slumlord. Catherine gathered her papers with efficient movements. When you're ready to dispose of it, Daniel knows contractors who can handle the demolition and land sale. Consider it a family favor. She stood and Daniel followed. Both of them preparing to leave to return to their important lives in expensive cars and the comfortable knowledge that they'd gotten what they deserved. What they'd earned through building empires and making partner and not wasting their time teaching art to ungrateful teenagers. At the door, Daniel paused and turned back. His grin had faded into something that might have been genuine concern if Elena hadn't known him better. Seriously, Elena, call me when you're ready to dump it. I'll make sure you get at least enough to cover the hassle. Then they were gone. The door closed with a soft click that sounded like a coffin lid. Elena sat in the sudden silence, staring at her hands folded on the table, breathing carefully through the rage and humiliation and the small, stupid part of her that had hoped for something different. Patterson pushed a thick manila envelope across the table. Inside, you'll find the property deed, GPS coordinates, keys to the structure, and a personal letter from your grandmother. Elena took the envelope with numb fingers. It was heavier than she'd expected. I should tell you, Patterson continued, his voice gentler. Now, your grandmother spoke very highly of you in our meetings. Very highly. She was quite clear that you were to receive the mountain property specifically because, and I quote, Elena will understand when the time is right. What's there to understand? The words came out harder than Elena intended. It's a worthless shack my siblings are right to laugh at. Patterson studied her for a long moment. Your grandmother was many things, Miss Morgan, but she wasn't cruel and she wasn't foolish. If she left you this property, she had reasons. He stood and gathered his papers. Take your time. The room is yours for as long as you need. When he left, Elena finally let herself feel it. Not tears she'd run out of those somewhere around month 3 of sleeping in her car. Just a hollow ache that started in her chest and spread outward until her entire body felt empty. Sophie shifted in her seat. Mom, I know, baby. Uncle Daniel was mean. He was. And Aunt Catherine, too. Yeah, she was. Sophie pulled the manila envelope closer and opened it carefully. Inside was a smaller jewelry box, aged leather with tarnished brass clasps. She opened it and gasped. Mom, look. Maggie's jade bracelet. The one Elena had admired every time she'd visited her grandmother. The one Catherine had probably assumed would be part of her jade collection. It was simple and beautiful, the green stone worn smooth by decades of wear. Elena lifted it out with shaking hands. Inside, the band engraved in delicate script, For Maggie for keeping promises 1967. Grandma knew, Sophie said. She knew what you'd need. That night, Elena sat in the driver's seat of the Honda while Sophie slept in the back and finally opened the letter Patterson had mentioned. Maggie's handwriting covered 3 pages in the careful script of someone who'd taken her time, who'd known these words needed to last. My dearest Elena. It began. Elena pressed her hand to her mouth and kept reading. They laughed, didn't they, Daniel and Catherine? I knew they would. That's why I'm trusting you, not them. The mountain property isn't what it seems. Your great-great-grandmother, Sarah Blackwood, built that homestead in 1867. She was half Chinese, half Ute, rejected by both worlds. But she survived. She thrived. And she hid something there, something I've protected for 45 years, waiting for the right person. Not the richest person, not the most successful. The right person. You, Elena. You've been tested by life in ways they never have. Homeless, divorced, broke. But you still protect Sophie's joy. Still teach beauty to ungrateful teenagers. Still believe in goodness. That's rare. That's strong. Go to the cabin, northeast corner, loose floorboard. Look for the trapdoor. Combination is 1AM867, the year Sarah built her home. What's below will change everything. But Elena, listen. How you use it will define who you are. This isn't just money. It's a 150-year promise Sarah made. I've kept it. Now I'm passing it to you. Trust yourself. You survived homelessness with grace. You can handle this. I love you. I've always been proudest of you. At the bottom of the envelope, wrapped in tissue paper, was a pocket watch. Gold, heavy, ornate. Elena turned it over and found an inscription. To Sarah. Time reveals all truths. 1867. The watch still ticked. Perfect rhythm. Keeping time after more than a century and a half. Elena held it to her ear and listened to the steady beat. And for the first time in months, let herself imagine that maybe tomorrow would be different from today. Friday afternoon, Elena deposited her paycheck and watched the money vanish into obligations before it even felt real. $900 to storage, $420 to insurance, $250 to credit cards. The remaining $610 had to last 30 days. She allowed herself $120 for this trip. Gas, food, basic camping supplies. If there was really a trap door under the cabin floor, they'd need equipment to explore it. Walmart again, but this time walking through the aisles as a customer rather than someone sleeping in the parking lot. 2 heavy-duty flashlights, climbing rope rated for 500-pound batteries, first aid kit, matches, emergency blankets, food that wouldn't spoil, peanut butter, bread, apples, granola bars, bottled water. The total came to $99.34. Elena stared at the receipt and did the mental math. $510 left for 28 days, $18.21 per day for everything else. Sophie watched her mother calculate and didn't ask the question they both knew hovered unspoken. What happens if there's nothing under the cabin? What happens if Grandma Maggie was confused at the end and there's no trapdoor, no hidden treasure, just 40 acres of Colorado mountainside, and a structure so run down it wasn't worth $5, let alone $5 million. They loaded the supplies into the Honda's trunk, cramming them between the plastic bins that held their entire lives. Sophie's clothes, Elena's clothes, books, art supplies, the few photos Elena had grabbed when David changed the locks. Everything that mattered reduced to what fit in a 15-year-old SUV. The drive took 3 hours through late February cold. They left Denver sprawl behind and climbed into mountains that still held snow in shadowed places. The heater in the Honda worked intermittently, blasting hot air for 10 minutes and then giving up entirely. Elena wrapped Sophie in 2 coats and kept driving. Sophie did homework by the dome light, practicing long division in a notebook balanced on her knees. She asked about irregular verbs and state capitals and whether butterflies could fly in the rain. Normal questions that a 9-year-old should ask her mother on a road trip, not the questions Elena heard underneath. Will we have a place to live after this? Will things get better? Are we going to be okay? The Honda's check engine light came on somewhere past the town of Fairplay. Elena watched it glow orange on the dashboard and added it to the list of things she couldn't afford to fix. The car struggled on steep grades, engine whining in protest. Elena pressed the accelerator and prayed to a God she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. Just get us there. Just hold together until we see what's waiting. The turnoff appeared just as the GPS died. Signal lost to mountain terrain. Elena pulled over and consulted the paper map from Maggie's envelope. A narrow dirt road branched from the main highway, marked by a faded wooden post that she would have missed if she hadn't been looking for it. The sign read, Copper Ridge Trail 4-wheel drive recommended. Elena looked at her 2-wheel drive Honda with its check engine light and worn tires and made a choice. They'd come this far. The dirt road was worse than expected. Deep ruts carved by runoff rocks that scraped the undercarriage branches that whipped against the windows. The Honda bounced and struggled and somehow kept going. 15 minutes of teeth-rattling progress, climbing steadily higher trees, pressing close on both sides. Then the road opened into a clearing, and Elena's foot hit the brake hard enough that Sophie lurched forward against her seatbelt. The cabin sat 50 feet ahead, caught in the dying light of late afternoon. It was smaller than Elena had imagined, maybe 20 feet square, built from logs that had weathered to silver gray. The roof sagged on the left side, several shingles missing, creating gaps like missing teeth. The front porch had partially collapsed, one corner touching the ground at an angle that suggested complete structural failure wasn't far off. But it was the setting that stole Elena's breath. The cabin had been built directly against a cliff-face granite wall, rising 100 feet straight up, creating a natural barrier that made the property feel both protected and trapped. Pine trees surrounded the clearing, their branches heavy with old snow. In the fading light, shadows pulled between the trunks like dark water. It's like a witch's house, Sophie whispered. Then after a pause, but a good witch. Like Grandma was good. Elena parked 20 feet from the cabin and turned off the engine. The sudden silence was profound. No traffic sounds, no city hum, just wind through pine branches and the settling sounds of the Honda's engine cooling. They sat without moving, staring at the structure that represented either their salvation or the final confirmation that they were alone in the world with nothing and no one but each other. Elena's phone buzzed. One bar of signal flickering in and out. A text from Daniel. Lawsuit filed. Monday 9 a.m. hearing. Hope you're ready. She stared at the words until they stopped making sense, then turned the phone face down and looked at her daughter. We'll sleep in the car tonight. In the morning, we'll see what's inside. Sophie nodded and began the familiar routine of arranging coats for blankets. Elena reclined her seat and stared through the windshield at the cabin's dark shape against the darker cliff. Somewhere in Denver, Daniel was probably in his penthouse drinking expensive scotch, confident that Monday's hearing would overturn Maggie's crazy will and divide the property properly among people who actually deserved it. Catherine was probably in her Maserati driving to some event, the mountain property already forgotten as irrelevant. And Elena was here in a car that might not start tomorrow morning with her 9-year-old daughter and a letter from a dead grandmother who'd promised that everything would change. The cabin's windows were dark and empty. No glass remained, just rectangular holes that looked like closed eyes. The door hung crooked on its hinges, partly open, revealing nothing but shadow. Elena closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but her mind kept returning to Maggie's words. Northeast corner, loose floorboard, trapdoor combination, 1867. What's below will change everything. Sophie's breathing deepened into sleep. Elena lay awake watching stars appear through breaks in the clouds, listening to wind in the pines. And somewhere around midnight, she heard it. Something. Glass breaking, or maybe a branch falling, or maybe nothing at all. Just the sound of an old structure continuing its slow collapse. Or maybe someone else knew about this place. Maybe Maggie had told someone before she died. Maybe they weren't as alone here as Elena had hoped. She sat up slowly, peering through the windshield at the cabin. Nothing moved. No lights, no shadows shifting where they shouldn't. Just an abandoned structure settling into ruin. Probably nothing. Elena lay back down and pulled her coat tighter and told herself that tomorrow everything would be different. Tomorrow they'd find what Sarah Blackwood had hidden 158 years ago. Tomorrow their lives would change. She almost believed it. Morning came cold and bright. Frost had painted fern patterns across the Honda's windows, turning the world outside into crystalline blur. Elena woke to Sophie already sitting up, staring at the cabin through the passenger window with an intensity that suggested she'd been watching for a while. "How long have you been awake?" "A while. I was listening." "Listening for what?" "To see if it talked." Elena almost smiled. "Houses don't talk, baby. Grandma's house did." "You said so. You said old houses tell stories if you know how to listen." The memory surfaced unbidden. Elena at Sophie's age sitting in Maggie's kitchen while her grandmother explained how wood grain held time, how foundation cracks mapped decades, how every house whispered its history to those patient enough to hear. Daniel had called it hippie nonsense. Catherine had rolled her eyes. But Elena had listened and learned and carried that lesson into her teaching, into the way she helped teenagers see that art wasn't about making pretty pictures, but about paying attention to what the world was trying to say. Let's go hear what this one has to say. They approached the cabin with the caution of people who'd learned that structures could betray you. Elena tested each porch board before committing weights. The wood groaned but held. 3 of the boards were soft with rot flexing under pressure. She marked them mentally and stepped over, guiding Sophie to do the same. The door required force. Swollen from weather, it scraped against the frame with a sound like fingernails on wood. The hinges shrieked, and then they were inside. The smell hit first. Decades of dust thick enough to coat the back of Elena's throat. Mouse droppings in the corners. Old wood releasing the faint tang of resin. Underneath, something else, something mineral and cold that seemed to rise from the floorboards themselves. One room, 20 feet by 20 feet, maybe less. A pot-bellied stove squatted in the far corner, rust eating through cast iron. A table leaned against the wall, one leg snapped clean through. Shelves lined the eastern side, empty except for tin cups that had oxidized to tarnished green. An alcove extended to the north, just large enough for sleeping. Light filtered through gaps in the roof, creating columns of illuminated dust that moved with their breathing. Every surface wore gray film undisturbed, except where their feet now left prints in patterns that would remain until the next wind found its way inside. Elena ran her finger across the table's surface, leaving a trail through decades of accumulation. Someone lived here. Sophie moved through the space like a detective, examining everything with careful attention. Someone lived, made this home. She stopped near the alcove, crouched down. "Mom, look." The dust told its own story. Near the door where weather had found entry, the coating was thicker, but in the protected corner of the alcove, the layer was thinner. And in one spot, no dust at all, just clean wood, as if something had rested there recently and been removed. Someone was here. Not long ago. Elena knelt beside her daughter, studying the pattern. A rectangular outline in the dust, maybe a foot long, 6 inches wide. Something box-shaped had sat here, protected from the elements until recently removed. Maybe Grandma. Sophie's eyes widened. Or someone took it. Someone else knows about this place. Elena didn't answer because she didn't have one that wouldn't frighten her daughter more. Instead, she stood and began a systematic examination. The walls were solid. The timbers aged but not rotted through. The stove was beyond salvage, but its presence suggested the cabin had been functional, once lived in, heated against mountain cold. The alcove showed signs of careful construction. The logs fitted with precision that spoke of skill. On the shelves, she found nothing but those tin cups and the dried corpse of a mouse. The table's broken legs showed a clean break, recent enough that the exposed wood hadn't weathered. Elena lifted the table and found initials carved into the underside. SB 1867. Sarah Blackwood. Great-great-grandmother who'd built this place with her own hands. Chinese and Ute, rejected by both worlds according to Maggie's letter. Elena traced the carved letters and felt something shift in her chest. Connection across 5 generations. Blood calling to blood. Mom, come here. Elena crossed the room in 3 steps. Sophie was staring at the floor at a spot where her foot had disturbed the dust. This board moved when I stepped on it. Elena knelt and pressed her hand to the floorboard in question. It shifted. Not much, but enough. The nails had been pulled and replaced often enough that the wood had lost its grip. Elena worked her fingers into the gap between boards and pulled. The board came up easily. Beneath it, more boards ran perpendicular, and wedged between them, partially visible, was a metal tin about the size of a shoebox. Elena's hands were steady as she freed it from its hiding place. The tin was old, but intact, sealed against moisture by a layer of wax that cracked as she pried the lid open. Inside, wrapped in wax paper, were 3 photographs and a handwritten memo note. The first photograph showed a woman standing in front of this cabin. Not young, maybe 40 or 50, with features that marked her as exactly what Maggie had described. Asian eyes, native cheekbone, skin that suggested mixed heritage in an era when that marked you as belonging nowhere. She wore work clothes and held herself with the posture of someone who'd learned to claim space despite the world's resistance. On the back, in faded ink, Sarah Blackwood, 1867. The second showed the same woman, older now, maybe 60. She stood in the same spot but held something in her hands, something small and rectangular that the photograph's age had rendered too blurry to identify. The third photograph made Elena's breath catch. A young Maggie, maybe 30 years old, standing in this cabin in this very room. She smiled at the camera with the same determination Sarah had shown. On the back, Margaret Stone, 1974. The note was written in Sarah's hand, the paper fragile enough that Elena handled it like prayer. For daughters of my blood who come after, look beneath where I rest my head. The mountain keeps promises. Elena read it twice. Sophie leaned close enough that her hair brushed Elena's cheek, studying the photographs with focused intensity. She looks like us. Sophie touched Sarah's image with one careful finger. Same eyes. Elena saw it too. The shape of Sophie's face echoed in Sarah's bones. The set of Elena's jaw mirrored in how Sarah held her head. 5 generations, and the blood still carried forward, visible and undeniable. Beneath where I rest my head. Elena looked toward the alcove, the sleeping area. Northeast corner, just as Maggie's letter had said. They moved together, mother and daughter, to the alcove's far corner. Elena examined the floorboards with new attention. One board slightly different from the others. Newer wood, or at least more recently placed. She pressed down and felt it give. This one. She pulled and the board came free. Beneath it, 2 more boards. She removed those and revealed what lay underneath. A wooden hatch 3 feet square fitted so perfectly into the subfloor that it had been invisible until exposed. An iron ring handle set into the wood, and beside it, built into the hatch itself, a combination lock. 3 rotating dials, numbers 0 through 9 on each. Sophie's voice came out barely above a whisper. The trapdoor. Lena pulled Maggie's letter from her pocket with shaking hands. 1867. The year Sarah built her home. She set the first dial. 1867. Her fingers found the iron ring and pulled. The lock clicked open with a sound that seemed to echo forever in the small cabin. Elena lifted the hatch, slowly fighting hinges that groaned after decades without movement. Cool air rushed up from below, carrying the smell of deep earth and minerals, and something else, something that suggested vast spaces hidden under their feet. Elena pulled the heavy-duty flashlight from her backpack and aimed it into the darkness below. The beam revealed wooden ladder rungs descending into shadow. She could see the first 10 or 12 worn smooth by hands that had climbed up and down for years. Beyond that, the light couldn't penetrate. What's down there? Sophie's voice carried equal parts excitement and fear. I don't know, but Grandma knew and Sarah knew before her. Are we going down? Elena looked at the ladder, at the darkness, at her 9-year-old daughter whose life had already asked too much courage from her. Not yet. First we make sure it's and we need more supplies. The drive to Copperfield took 40 minutes on roads that deteriorated from paved to dirt to barely there, tracks that required constant attention. The town appeared suddenly tucked into a valley between mountains. Population sign promising 412 residents. One main street, a gas station that looked like it hadn't been updated since 1985. A diner with 3 pickup trucks parked outside. And at the end of the street, a 2-story building with a hand-painted sign, Ruth's General Store and Geological Supply, established 1956. The bell over the door chimed as Elena entered. The interior smelled of coffee and old wood and something baking in back. Shelves packed with everything from canned goods to fishing tackle to what appeared to be veterinary supplies. A place that served a community too far from civilization to afford specialization. The woman behind the counter looked up from a crossword puzzle and studied Elena with eyes that had spent 7 decades reading people. White hair pulled back in a bun face weathered by mountain sun and wind hands that moved with the efficiency of someone who'd spent a lifetime stocking shelves and making change. Help you, I needed supplies. Flashlights, rope, camping gear. The woman came around the counter with surprising agility, moving toward the back shelves. Camping up in the mountains. Getting late in the season. Weather can turn quick this high up, just for a day or two. Nothing extensive. The woman gathered items as Elena listed them. 2 more heavy-duty flashlights, batteries, waterproof, matches, emergency blankets, a first aid kit that looked military surplus. She moved through the store like she'd arranged everything herself and knew exactly where each item lived. You're not from around here, no, but my grandmother owned property nearby. Property nearby, the woman's expression shifted, curiosity sharpening. What was your grandmother's name? Margaret Stone. The crossword puzzle forgotten. The woman stopped moving and turned to face Elena directly. Margaret Stone. Well, I'll be damned. You're her granddaughter. I am. I'm Elena. This is my daughter, Sophie. Ruth Campbell Hayes. I run this place. The woman's handshake was dry and strong. Knew your grandmother 40 years, maybe more. Heard she passed. I'm sorry for your loss. Thank you. Ruth rang up the supplies with practiced efficiency, but her attention stayed on Elena's face, reading things that probably showed more clearly than Elena intended. Margaret used to come through here every few months, regular as clockwork. She'd buy supplies and head up to that mountain property of hers. Do you know what she was doing up there? Ruth leaned against the counter, studying Elena with an intensity that felt like assessment. Never asked, figured it wasn't my business. But I'll tell you what I noticed. She bought specific things. Survey equipment sometimes, rock hammers, those heavy lanterns that miners use. And she'd stay up there for weeks, alone. Elena felt her pulse quicken. Did anyone ever go with her? Not that I saw, always solo. Ruth paused, then made a decision. You know, there's a geologist in town, retired professor from Colorado School of Mines. That's me, actually. I own the store and consult on the side. Margaret used to bring me rock samples sometimes. Why are you telling me this? Ruth's smile carried knowledge. Because Margaret was private about what she was doing, but she wasn't secretive with people she trusted. And if you're here asking about supplies for that property, you're probably about to need someone who understands rocks. Ruth's house stood behind a garden that looked like a geological museum. Specimens arranged on low walls labeled rock formations, creating borders. Even the stepping stones were chosen for their fossil content. Elena knocked and waited, Sophie beside her, both of them dusty from the cabin and uncertain about involving anyone else in whatever Maggie had left them. The woman who opened the door was the same Ruth from the store, but here in her element, she seemed taller, somehow more focused. She gestured them inside without preamble. The house's interior had been converted to a workspace that would make any geologist weep. Shelves lined every wall, packed with labeled specimens. A massive desk held microscopes and testing equipment. Geological maps covered available wall space, Colorado's underground, rendered in careful detail. Ruth cleared papers from 2 chairs and gestured for Elena and Sophie to sit. Then she opened a filing cabinet and pulled out a folder labeled in neat script, Stone Confidential. Margaret came to me 15 years ago, brought rock samples, asked me to analyze them quietly. Ruth opened the folder revealing photographs and typed reports. I'm a geologist, spent 45 years studying Colorado mineral deposits. Retired now, but Margaret knew I wouldn't talk. What did you find? Ruth spread photographs across the desk. Close-ups of rock samples the stone shot through with gleaming veins that caught light like captured stars. Wire silver, museum-quality specimens. The formation is exceptional. Purity remarkable. She watched Elena's face. Conservative estimate for just the samples Margaret brought me, $4 to $6 million. The room tilted. Elena gripped the chair arms and tried to process numbers that didn't fit in any mental category she had available. Ruth wasn't finished. But that's just samples. If there's a vein, an actual producing vein of this quality, we're talking $18 to $25 million, maybe more. Sophie made a sound, half gasp, half whimper. Elena pulled her close and tried to breathe through the shock. Why didn't Grandma mine it? Ruth's expression softened. She said it wasn't about the money. She mentioned indigenous heritage, sacred sites, a promise someone had made a long time ago. She was negotiating some kind of agreement, said when the time was right, someone in her family would honor it. The older woman leaned forward, studying Elena with the same intensity she probably used on geological formations. I'm guessing that someone is you. I don't know yet. I don't even know if what she left me contains any of this. Ruth stood and began gathering equipment. I'd like to visit the site, do a proper assessment, but I need to be clear about something. I'm 74 years old. I have more money than I need and more years behind me than ahead. I'm not interested in exploiting your discovery. She met Elena's eyes. I just want to see a genuine find one more time before I die. Would that be acceptable? Elena felt the weight of decision pressing down. Involving someone else meant risk, meant trusting, meant exposing whatever lay under that cabin to another person's knowledge and judgment. But it also meant expertise, confirmation. Someone who could tell her if the dreams Maggie had planted were real or just the confused hopes of a dying woman trying to make meaning of a worthless inheritance. Yes, thank you. Ruth nodded and continued packing. Your brother is threatening to contest the will. You mentioned filing Monday. He texted me. 9 a.m. hearing. Then you need a lawyer. There's an attorney here, Samuel Brooks. He handles mineral rights cases. I'll call him. I don't have money for a lawyer. Ruth picked up her phone. Let me talk to Sam. He's a good man. He'll work something out. They were loading equipment into Ruth's battered pickup when Elena heard the sound. A vehicle engine approaching fast on the dirt road. She turned and felt her stomach drop. Daniel's Tesla Model X appeared through the trees, the white paint catching afternoon light. He pulled up beside the Honda with the aggressive confidence of someone who'd never learned to doubt his right to any space he occupied. The driver's door opened, and Daniel stepped out, phone pressed to his ear as always. He ended the call and surveyed Elena, Sophie, and Ruth with the assessment of a CEO evaluating a failing division. Elena, finally, you don't answer your phone. The lie came easily. No signal up at the cabin. Catherine and I hired an investigator. GPS tracker on your car. Seemed wise given your tendency to make poor decisions. Elena's hands clenched into fists. You're tracking me, protecting family interests. Daniel gestured to a second man emerging from the passenger seat, camera equipment in hand. This is Trevor Harris, property assessor. He'll be documenting the cabin's condition for our lawsuit. You don't have permission to assess anything. That property is mine. Actually, the will is in probate for 90 days, during which Catherine and I have the right to contest any distributions we believe are unfair or resulted from diminished capacity or undue influence. Trevor was already raising his camera, photographing the Honda that supplies Ruth's truck. Elena moved to block him, but Daniel stepped between them. This is trespassing. This is family property. We have every right to document its condition and ensure it's being managed responsibly. A second vehicle appeared. Catherine's Maserati, absurdly out of place on the dirt road, pulled up behind Daniel's Tesla. She emerged in clothes that cost more than Elena made in a month, looking around the town with visible distaste. So this is where Maggie's dementia led her. A mountain shack in the middle of nowhere. She walked toward Elena with the controlled aggression of a lawyer who'd won too many battles to expect defeat now. Elena, let's be adults about this. You're homeless, living in your car with Sophie. David is very concerned about her welfare. The world narrowed to pinpoint focus. Elena heard her voice come out level despite the rage flooding her system. You've been talking to my ex-husband about me. Someone has to think about Sophie's best interests. Catherine pulled a folder from her briefcase. We have documentation, photographs of you living in your vehicle, statements from David about the unstable living situation. A judge would be very interested. Daniel moved closer, tag teaming with practiced coordination. We're prepared to petition for emergency custody review if you won't be reasonable about the property. The threat landed like a physical blow. Elena felt Sophie press against her side, small and afraid. She put her arm around her daughter and forced herself to think through the panic. Sign over the property. Take $100,000 cash. We'll drop all custody concerns and you can get an apartment. Get stable. Provide Sophie with what she needs. Or refuse. Catherine's voice carried surgical precision. And we'll destroy you in court for the property and for Sophie. You can't afford that fight, Elena. We can. Ruth stepped forward, inserting herself between Elena and her siblings. I don't believe we've met. Dr. Ruth Hayes, retired geologist. She extended her hand with enough force that Daniel had to either shake it or commit to rudeness. I've been consulting on the property in question. It's quite fascinating from a geological perspective. Catherine's eyes narrowed. Consulting on what basis? On the basis that Elena asked me to, which she has every right to do as the legal owner. The property's value is being contested. Any assessments or consultations conducted before the hearing are premature and potentially fraudulent. Ruth smiled. I'm not assessing value for sale. I'm providing scientific analysis of geological formations. Perfectly legal and none of your concern. Trevor finished photographing and moved back toward Daniel. Got everything I need. Daniel turned back to Elena. Lawsuit files Monday morning, 9 a.m. Last chance to avoid this becoming ugly. $100,000. Take it and walk away. Elena looked at her brother, at her sister, at the people who should have been her safety net, when David left, when the money ran out, when the car became their home. People who'd laughed at her inheritance and were now desperate to take it from her. Get off my property. Her voice didn't shake. You have 10 seconds before I call the sheriff. There's no cell service here. Daniel's smile was patronizing. Then I guess we'll see how long you want to stand on allegedly your land without permission. Trevor was already in the Tesla. Daniel held Elena's stare for a long moment, looking for weakness, for the break that would let him push harder. He didn't find it. Monday, 9 a.m. Hope you've made arrangements for Sophie's care when this goes badly for you. They left in a convoy of expensive vehicles, kicking up dust that hung in the air long after the engine sounds faded. Elena stood in the settling silence, arms still around Sophie, trying to stop shaking. Ruth touched her shoulder. You need to find what's under that cabin now, before they come back with a court order. The drive back took 30 minutes. Elena's mind raced through implications and possibilities and the cold reality that Daniel and Catherine would use Sophie as a weapon if it meant winning. They'd make her homelessness look like neglect. They'd paint her as unfit. They'd take her daughter to get at 40 acres of mountain property that might contain nothing more valuable than the $5 Maggie had left in cash. Ruth followed in her truck, equipment rattling in the bed. When they reached the cabin, the older woman moved with purpose that suggested she'd been waiting for this moment for 15 years. Show me. Elena led her inside to the alcove, to the open trapdoor. Ruth knelt at the edge and shined her flashlight into the depths. The beam revealed the ladder descending into darkness that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. This goes deep, at least 30 feet, possibly more. Ruth looked up at Elena. You've been down? Not yet. Ruth stood and began unpacking climbing gear from her bag. Then let's see what Sarah Blackwood was protecting. Elena secured the rope around a roof beam that looked solid enough to hold weight. She tested the first ladder rung. It held. The second, the third. Each step required faith that a 150-year-old ladder wouldn't snap and send her plummeting into whatever waited below. I'll go first. You wait here. Sophie shook her head. We go together, baby. I need to make sure it's safe. We go together. Sophie's voice carried the same determination that had helped her survive 7 months of homelessness. We're a team, Mom, remember? Elena looked at her daughter and saw herself reflected back. Stubborn, brave, refusing to be left behind when the important things happened. She clipped a flashlight to Sophie's belt and adjusted the straps on the child-sized climbing harness Ruth had produced. Slowly. Test every rung. If anything feels wrong, we come back up. Okay. The descent took forever. Elena counted rungs to keep herself focused. 10, 20, 30. The air grew colder with each step, the smell of minerals intensifying. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness, each drop echoing. At 35 rungs, her feet touched solid stone. She unclipped from the safety line and helped Sophie down the last few steps. They stood together in a space that felt vast despite the darkness pressing close. Elena swept her flashlight in a slow arc and felt her breath catch. They were standing in a tunnel, hand-carved from granite, maybe 7 feet high and 5 feet wide. Timber beams supported the ceiling at regular intervals, installed with the care of someone who understood that mountains could kill you if you didn't respect them. The floor had been worn smooth by decades of foot traffic. This isn't a natural cave. Elena's voice echoed strangely. This is a mine. She called up to Ruth. We're in a tunnel. Looks hand-carved. Very old. The geologist's response drifted down. Follow it carefully. Look for ore deposits. Any samples you can bring up will help with assessment. Sophie walked beside Elena as they moved deeper into the tunnel. 50 feet. 70. The passage ran straight, then opened into a larger chamber where the mining work became obvious. Pick marks scored the walls in patterns that suggested systematic extraction. Against one wall, wooden crates stood stacked in careful rows. Elena approached the first crate and pried the lid free. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were chunks of rock shot through with veins that gleamed in the flashlight beam. Even with no geological knowledge, Elena could see these were different from ordinary stone. The veins had structure, crystalline formation, the kind of beauty that suggested value. Is this silver? Sophie touched one piece carefully. It's pretty. The second crate held mining tools, pickaxes and chisels and hammers, all hand-forged, all showing the wear of extensive use. One pickaxe handle had initials carved into the wood, SB. Sarah was here, working this mine. For how long, the third crate was smaller, constructed with more care than the others. Inside, protected by multiple layers of oilcloth, was a leather-bound journal. Elena lifted it out with hands that trembled despite her efforts at control. The leather had cracked with age but remained intact. She opened to the first page and read by flashlight, Journal of Sarah Blackwood, March 1867. The entries were detailed, written in careful script that suggested education. Sarah described her arrival in Colorado, her claim on the land, her discovery of the silver vein. The writing was matter-of-fact about hardships and clinical about mining techniques. March 15, 1867. I've claimed this land today. $1.25 per acre. Paid in gold I panned from the creek. The claims office didn't want to process it. A half-breed woman owning property. But law is law. This is mine. Elena read aloud and Sophie leaned close, both of them traveling back through time to meet the woman whose blood they carried. April 3, 1867. Built the cabin with my own hands. Men from town came to watch, to mock. A woman doing man's work, they said. Let them mock. By winter I'll have walls. They'll still be drunk in Silverton saloons. May 18, 1867. Found the vein today. Not gold, silver. Wire silver, the assayer said. Rare formation worth more than gold to the right buyers. I'll tell no one. A Chinese Ute woman with a silver mine. They'd kill me for it. The entries continued through summer, Sarah learning to extract ore, safely processing it in ways that kept the discovery hidden. Then in August, the tone changed. August 12, 1867. Met today with an elder of the Ute people. His name is Running Wolf. He knew I was here. Knew about my mining. I expected anger. Instead, he showed me kindness. He took me deeper into the mountain. Showed me sacred chambers where his people performed ceremonies. Places where young men came to become warriors. Where ancestors left offerings. I felt ashamed standing there with my pickaxe in my greed. Elena's voice caught as she read the next entry aloud. Running Wolf doesn't condemn my mining. Says the earth gives what it gives. But he asked me to make a promise. If I profit from this silver, I'll protect what his people left. Return it someday. I gave my word. It's the least I can do. The journal continued with entries about learning from Running Wolf, about finding connection with someone who understood being between worlds, about hiding the sacred objects. Sarah had been shown protecting them until the time was right for their return. At the back of the journal, tucked into a pocket in the binding, Elena found a hand-drawn map. It showed this chamber marked as first chamber main cache. 3 additional tunnels branched off. East labeled ore vein, west labeled water source, north labeled sacred place. A note at the bottom read, the covenant is in the sacred place. Honor it or lose everything. Mom. Sophie's voice was small. What's a covenant, a promise? A serious one. Sarah promised Running Wolf she'd protect the sacred things his people left here. She kept that promise her whole life. And Grandma Maggie kept it after her. Now it's ours to keep, even if it means we don't get the silver. Elena looked at her daughter and saw the question underneath the question. Even if it means we stay homeless. Even if it means we lose to Daniel and Catherine. Even if it means we have nothing. The answer came without hesitation. Even then. Some promises matter more than money. From somewhere deep in the tunnels came a sound faint but distinct, like footsteps or falling rock, or the settling of ancient timbers straining under mountain weight. Sophie pressed closer. What was that? Probably nothing. Old mines make noise as they settle, but Elena's hand found the rope and held tight, and both of them stared into the darkness beyond their flashlight beams, wondering what else Sarah had hidden in the mountain and whether they were truly alone down here. Elena's phone buzzed, signal finding some strange path through 30 feet of rock. She pulled it out and saw the text from Daniel. Lawsuit filed. Hearing Monday 9 a.m. property seizure requested pending outcome. Enjoy your weekend. She turned the phone face down and looked at the journal in her hands. At the map showing passages they hadn't yet explored. At her daughter standing brave in the darkness of a 150-year-old mine. We need to find the sacred chamber before Monday. Before they can stop us. We need to explore the northern tunnel today, before they file that court order. Ruth's voice carried the steady authority of someone who'd spent decades making decisions in the field. Then I'll contact Joseph White Eagle at the Ute Mountain Ute Tribal Council. We'll bring the tribe into this before Monday's hearing. What if my siblings get a court order? What if they show up with police? Then we make sure the documentation is somewhere they can't suppress it. Cloud storage. Multiple copies sent to people we trust, and we make sure the tribe knows everything before anyone can stop us. Elena thought about Daniel's threat. Property seizure pending outcome. If a judge granted that if the property was taken into custody while the lawsuit proceeded, access would be restricted. Evidence could disappear. The mine could be explored by assessors working for her siblings. And who knew what they'd do with what they found? Everything depended on today, on finding the sacred chamber, on reaching Joseph White Eagle before Daniel and Catherine could move against her. Elena checked her phone one more time. Still one bar of signal, still nothing but Daniel's text mocking her situation. She opened her photos and looked at the images of Sarah's journal at the map, showing passages, yet unexplored, at the promise made 158 years ago by a woman who'd had even less than Elena, but had still chosen honor over wealth. Your word is your wealth. Everything else is just metal in the ground, bum. Sarah had written that in a later entry Elena had photographed. The words settled into Elena's bones like truth she'd always known, but never had language for. The descent took less time now that they knew the ladder held. Elena went first, then Sophie, then Ruth, moving with careful deliberation that acknowledged 74 years of accumulated caution. At the bottom, they regrouped, checked equipment, and followed Sarah's map toward the northern passage. The tunnel narrowed as they progressed, 4 feet wide instead of 5. The ceiling dropped until Ruth had to stoop. Temperature fell with each step, cold enough that their breath became visible clouds in the flashlight beams. Water sounds grew louder, the drip and trickle of an underground stream finding paths through stone. After 200 feet, the passage opened into a natural cavern. Elena swept her light across space that felt vast despite walls she could see. Limestone formations hung from the ceiling's stalactites that had grown for millennia. The floor was uneven, water pooling in low spots, creating mirrors that reflected their lights back doubled. Against the far wall stood something that wasn't natural. A barrier built from stones of different colors stacked with deliberate care to fill a gap between floor and ceiling. Sarah's work hiding what Running Wolf had shown her. Ruth approached the wall and examined it with professional assessment. This has been here over a century, undisturbed. She touched one stone gently. Are you ready? Elena looked at Sophie, at her daughter's face illuminated by flashlight, seeing determination mixed with fear. We're ready. They worked slowly, removing stones one at a time, setting each aside with care that bordered on reverence. The wall was 3 feet thick. Behind it waited a chamber, perhaps 6 feet deep, naturally formed, protected by Sarah's barrier from any who might have stumbled this far into the mountain. Elena aimed her light into the revealed space and felt time collapse. Past and present meeting in darkness that had held secrets for generations. Wooden crates and woven baskets filled the small chamber. Everything dry, despite the cavern's moisture, protected by Sarah's careful placement and the stone barrier that had kept weather away. Elena reached for the nearest basket with hands that remembered how to be gentle despite 7 months of surviving rough. The woven material felt impossibly fragile. She lifted it clear and set it on level ground, kneeling beside it, while Sophie and Ruth pressed close. The lid came away, revealing pottery fragments, each piece decorated with geometric patterns rendered in black against red clay. These are old. Ruth's voice carried the reverence of someone who understood what they were seeing. 200 years, maybe more. Ute ceremonial pottery. Elena photographed each piece before moving to the next container. Ceremonial objects wrapped in leather that had somehow survived. Beaded items with patterns that told stories she couldn't read. Tools made from bone and stone carved with precision that suggested both utility and art. Mom. Sophie had opened a small wooden box. Look. Inside, wrapped in cloth so old it nearly disintegrated at touch, were 3 pages torn from Sarah's journal. The paper was fragile as ash, but the ink had held. Sarah's careful script still legible after a century and a half. Elena read by flashlight, voice shaking as she spoke words that bridged time. August 12th, 1867. Met today with Ute Elder. His name is Running Wolf. He knew I was here, knew about my mining. I expected anger. Instead, he showed me kindness. He took me deeper into the mountain, showed me sacred chambers where his people performed ceremonies, places where young men came to become warriors, where ancestors left offerings. I felt ashamed standing there with my pickaxe and my greed. The second page continued Sarah's account. Running Wolf's stories about the mountain, about his people's connection to this place, about why the chambers mattered, beyond any practical value they might hold. The third page made Elena stop reading and simply stare at words written in 1867 by a woman who'd understood exactly what was being asked of her. I've hidden everything, Running Wolf showed me behind a wall that looks natural. His people can reclaim when time is right. I've also hidden my best silver samples. If greedy men come, they'll find enough in obvious places. But real treasure, both sacred objects and finest silver, stays safe. Let these pages testify. I broke no laws, harmed no one, and I kept my word to a friend. If I die here, may my blood daughters, who come after, honor what I've protected. Ruth photographed everything while Elena sat with the pages in her hands and understood fully what Maggie had passed to her. Not just wealth, not just property, but a covenant made between two people society had pushed to its edges. People who had found in each other something worth more than any metal pulled from stone. We need to contact the tribe now before the hearing. The drive to Toyok took 3 hours through mountain passes that still held snow and shadowed cuts. Ruth rode with them, navigating while Elena drove, and Sophie slept in the back seat, exhausted by revelation and the weight of carrying history. The Ute Mountain Ute Tribal Headquarters occupied a modern building that managed to honor tradition while existing firmly in present necessity. Joseph White Eagle met them in an office whose walls held maps of traditional territories, photographs of ceremonies, documentation of a people's refusal to vanish, despite everything history had tried to take from them. He was maybe 55, with gray threading through black hair and eyes that assessed before offering trust. Ruth made introductions, and Joseph's expression shifted when he heard Elena's name. Morgan, Margaret Stone's granddaughter. We've been waiting 7 years. He listened while Elena explained, showed him photographs of the artifacts, Sarah's torn journal pages, the map of tunnels. Joseph studied everything with focused intensity, then called 2 elders into his office. The older men examined the photographs with hands that trembled slightly, passing images back and forth while speaking in Ute, too rapid for Elena to follow. One elder looked up with moisture in his eyes and spoke directly to Joseph. He says these belonged to his great-great-grandmother. She spoke of a sacred chamber. The location was lost 5 generations ago. This is homecoming. Joseph turned back to Elena. Your ancestor Sarah Blackwood protected what was ours. Your grandmother Margaret continued that protection. Now you complete it. There's more. Elena felt the words catch in her throat. My siblings are contesting the will. They've filed for property seizure. The hearing is tomorrow morning. If they win, I lose access to everything. Joseph's jaw tightened. Then we intervene. Federal heritage law gives us standing. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, NAGP, RA. If your siblings want to fight, they'll face us and federal oversight. One of the elders spoke again, this time looking directly at Elena and Sophie. Joseph translated. He says you have the look. Mountain people look. Sarah Blackwood's mother's Ute White River Band. Blood is blood. You're not just returning our heritage. Your family returning what was taken. Elena felt something shift in her chest. Family. The word that Daniel and Catherine had weaponized, that David had discarded, that she'd thought meant nothing beyond DNA and shared history. But here it meant something different. It meant covenant and promise and the choice to honor what mattered beyond self-interest. We have the draft agreement Margaret negotiated. Joseph pulled a document from his file. Sacred chambers and artifacts returned to tribal control. Mineral rights remain with your family. 10% of any mining proceeds go to our cultural preservation fund. Only 10%. That seems low if the silver is worth what Ruth estimates. Joseph smiled. Margaret insisted. She said the silver was yours, the sacred objects were ours. Fair exchange. The document was professionally prepared, detailed, ready for signatures that had waited 7 years. At the bottom, 2 blank lines. One labeled property owner, the other tribal council chairman, Ute Mountain Ute Tribe. We'll file intervention papers today. Emergency motion. Judge will have to consider tribal interest before ruling on seizure. Thank you. Elena's voice barely held steady. Thank you for believing us. We believe in keeping promises, even when it takes 5 generations. Monday morning arrived too fast and too cold. Elena dressed in her funeral clothes again because they were the only professional outfit she owned. Sophie wore her school uniform. They drove to Denver in silence, Ruth following in her truck, both vehicles carrying documentation that represented 158 years of women choosing right over easy. The courthouse was the same building where Maggie's will had been read, but this time they entered a different floor, a different courtroom facing different consequences. Judge Martha Morrison presided, a woman in her mid-60s whose face suggested she'd heard every argument and excuse twice and wasn't impressed by either. Daniel and Catherine sat with Stanley Richter at the plaintiff's table, $3,000 suits and confidence that money could reshape reality to preference. They barely glanced at Elena as she took her seat with Samuel Brooks, the local attorney Ruth had convinced to take the case. Sam was 60-something, weathered by mountain living, and possessed the kind of quiet competence that came from winning cases through preparation rather than intimidation. He'd reviewed everything over the weekend, made phone calls, filed responses that Elena couldn't have afforded if he'd charged his normal rate. Joseph White Eagle and two tribal elders sat in the gallery. Their presence changed the room's energy in ways Daniel and Catherine clearly hadn't anticipated. Richter kept glancing back, assessing this unexpected variable. Judge Morrison called the courtroom to order. Her voice carried the efficiency of someone who valued time and despised waste. This is a will contest. Plaintiffs Daniel Morgan and Catherine Morgan Hayes claim diminished capacity and undue influence. Defendant responds that the will was properly executed and reflects the deceased's clear intent. Additionally, we have an emergency intervention motion from the Ute Mountain Ute Tribal Council. Mr. Richter, proceed. Richter stood and delivered his opening with practiced polish. The will was irrational. Elena received essentially nothing while her siblings received millions. This suggests mental impairment. Furthermore, Elena's current homelessness raises questions about her ability to manage property and about whether she manipulated an elderly woman through increased contact during cognitive decline. Sam's response was quieter but carried weight. The evidence will show Margaret Stone had full mental capacity when executing her will. Medical records attorney testimony and her own video testament confirm she understood exactly what she was doing and why. Elena received property worth substantially more than her siblings' shares, but it required specific character qualities to manage properly. Qualities Margaret believed Elena possessed. Judge Morrison reviewed documents while both lawyers waited. Medical records first, then the will itself, then something that made her eyebrows rise slightly. There's a video testament. Sam stood. Yes, Your Honor. Recorded 2 weeks before Mrs. Stone's death at her attorney's office. She specifically addresses the likelihood of this contest. Richter objected immediately. Video testimony is prejudicial and potentially inadmissible. It's a testamentary document. Perfectly admissible. Judge Morrison didn't look up from her papers. We'll view it after live testimony. Catherine testified first, describing Maggie's supposed confusion in final months. Repeated stories, forgotten names, moments of seeming disorientation. Her presentation was professional, clinical, designed to paint a picture of cognitive decline without appearing cruel. Sam's cross-examination was surgical. How many times did you visit your grandmother in her final 2 years? Catherine hesitated. Perhaps 5 or 6 times, 5 or 6 visits in 24 months. And based on this limited contact, you claim expertise regarding her mental state. I also consulted with her physicians. Did any physician diagnose dementia or cognitive impairment? Not formally, but so your claim rests on your interpretation during occasional visits, not medical diagnosis. Catherine's composure cracked slightly. My grandmother left my sister essentially nothing while giving us millions. That's not rational. Sam introduced Maggie's medical records, cognitive tests showing normal function, neurological examinations revealing no impairment, doctor's notes describing a patient alert-oriented and fully competent to make legal decisions. Daniel testified next, focusing on Elena's homelessness as evidence of poor judgment. She's living in her car with a 9-year-old. That's not someone capable of managing a multi-million-dollar property. Sam's cross was equally direct. When did you learn your sister was homeless? A few months ago. Her ex-husband mentioned it. What did you do to help? I offered advice. Financial assistance, a place to stay. She didn't ask. Did she need to ask, she's your sister? Daniel shifted uncomfortably. I have my own obligations, including expensive cars and a penthouse, but not including helping your homeless sister and niece, the point landed. Judge Morrison made a note. Sam called his witnesses. Ruth testified about Maggie's mental acuity during their 15-year professional relationship. Frederick Patterson explained the will's execution, the competency evaluation. Maggie's explicit instructions. Then Joseph White Eagle took the stand. He explained the sacred chamber, the artifacts, the federal heritage protections that applied. He described Maggie's 7-year negotiation with the tribe, the draft agreement that demonstrated intentional planning rather than confused impulse. Your grandmother was thinking very clearly. Margaret knew exactly what she was protecting and why. She was waiting for the right person to complete what Sarah Blackwood started. This triggered examination of the journal, the photographs, the torn pages with Sarah's covenant. The courtroom grew quiet as evidence accumulated, building a picture not of confused elderly woman, but of deliberate succession planning spanning 5 generations. Finally, Sam addressed the judge. Your Honor, we have one final piece of evidence, Margaret Stone's video testament. The bailiff set up a screen. The lights dimmed slightly and Maggie appeared sitting at a conference table looking directly into the camera with eyes that held complete clarity. Her voice filled the courtroom. My name is Margaret Stone. I'm recording this of sound mind to address what I know will be challenges to my will. Daniel and Catherine will contest. I expect this. I've known them their whole lives. They see only money, success, status. They don't understand legacy. Elena felt tears burning but kept her face still. Sophie squeezed her hand. Maggie continued. Elena is different. She's faced poverty, divorce, homelessness, but she stayed kind. Protected her daughter's joy when she had nothing. That strength Daniel and Catherine have never needed. The mountain property isn't just land. It's a covenant my great-great-grandmother Sarah made to the Ute people. I've kept that promise 70 years. Elena will complete it. The video showed Maggie leaning forward, speaking directly to whoever would watch. Daniel built a company. Catherine made partner. I'm proud of them, but those achievements don't require character, just ambition. Keeping a promise when it costs everything that requires character. And Elena has that. She's proven it every day she's been homeless, but still taught beauty to ungrateful teenagers. Still protected her daughter. Daniel would sell to the highest bidder. Catherine would turn it into legal complications. But Elena will do what's right. That's why she inherits the mountain. Not because I love them less, because Elena is fit for this responsibility. Stand firm, Elena. I'm proud of you. The video ended. Judge Morrison sat in silence for what felt like forever. Then she looked at Daniel and Catherine with an expression that suggested she'd reached conclusions about them that went beyond legal questions. I've heard enough. The will contest is denied. Medical evidence overwhelmingly supports Margaret Stone's mental capacity. Her video testament shows she anticipated this challenge, which actually proves exceptional clarity rather than confusion. Furthermore, federal heritage law protections apply. The property contains Native American sacred sites requiring specific management. Division would violate federal protections. She fixed Daniel and Catherine with a stare that could freeze water. Your grandmother's video makes clear she understood your characters quite well. You received substantial inheritances, more than enough for comfortable lives. But you're here trying to take what she specifically left to someone else because you can't accept that she valued qualities you don't possess. The gavel fell. Will stands as written. Elena Morgan is sole owner. Case dismissed with prejudice. I'm awarding costs and attorney fees to defendant. The courtroom erupted in quiet celebration. Joseph and the elders rose, approaching Elena with embraces that crossed cultural boundaries through shared victory. Ruth gripped her shoulder. Sam gathered his papers with satisfaction. Daniel and Catherine stood frozen for a moment. Then Catherine gathered her briefcase with mechanical precision and walked out without a word. Daniel lingered, staring at the floor where his confidence had shattered against Maggie's video testament. Outside the courthouse, Daniel caught up to Elena before she reached the parking structure. He looked smaller, somehow diminished by defeat that had nothing to do with money. I watched that video 20 times last night. She knew exactly what we'd do. She predicted everything. Elena stopped walking but didn't speak. Let him work through whatever realization was trying to surface. Catherine and I are successful, rich, respected. But Grandma didn't trust us. She trusted you. That hurts more than losing the property. You could have been trustworthy. It's not too late. Daniel looked at her with something that might have been the beginning of understanding. Maybe, I don't know how to be the person she saw in you. Start by showing up to Sophie's birthday next month. No expensive gift, just show up. He nodded slowly and walked away, getting into his vehicle where Catherine waited with an expression like carved ice. They drove off together, but something had changed. The absolute certainty they'd carried into the courtroom had cracked. Elena watched them disappear into Denver traffic and felt no triumph, only exhaustion and relief and the strange hollowness that comes when a fight you've prepared for ends more quietly than expected. 2 weeks later, Elena sat across a desk from Dr. Harrison Wright, a private collector whose museum consulting work had made him expert in exactly the kind of silver Sarah had extracted. Ruth had arranged the meeting after authenticating the samples against every geological database available. Wright handled the ore specimens with reverence that exceeded even Ruth's. These are museum quality. The formation is textbook perfect with full provenance documentation back to 1867. He looked up. $4.5 million for the sample collection. Cash transaction. Additionally, I'd like to feature select pieces in the Denver Museum of Natural History. Exhibition fees of $120,000 annually. Elena tried to process numbers that still didn't feel real. That's more than I make in 100 years of teaching. Wright smiled. Your great-great-grandmother died without ever selling these. She valued something more than their market price. I respect that. All pieces will be displayed with full attribution. Sarah Blackwood collection preserved by Margaret Stone, donated by Elena Morgan. One condition, Elena's voice was steady. 10% of sale proceeds go directly to the Ute Mountain Ute Cultural Preservation Fund. Wright's eyebrows rose. That's $450,000 you're giving away. Sarah made a promise. I'm keeping all of it, not just the convenient parts. The transaction finalized within a week. 4.5 million reduced by attorney fees and tribal donation left Elena with $3,780,000. She transferred $500,000 to a trust for Sophie's future, invested $2 million conservatively, and kept the rest liquid. The first thing she bought was a 3-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood with good schools. Not expensive, not flashy, just a place where Sophie could have her own room and Elena could stop pretending they were on an adventure. The second thing was continuation of her teaching position. 3 months later, the dedication ceremony happened on a September morning when mountain aspens turned gold against evergreen darkness. 75 people attended, tribal members. Ruth Sam, local historians, and Daniel, who showed up as requested and stood awkwardly until Sophie pulled him forward to stand with family. A bronze plaque was mounted near the cabin entrance. Sarah Blackwood, Sacred Heritage Site. In honor of Sarah Blackwood, 1845 to 1918, who built with her hands and kept her word. Margaret Stone, 1930 to 2021, who protected what was not hers to take. Elena Morgan, who chose honor over wealth. Protected by covenant. Preserved for generations. Joseph spoke first. 3 generations of women teaching us that stewardship matters more than ownership. Sarah protected what belonged to our people. Margaret continued that protection. Elena completed it. This is how promises should work across time, across cultures, across the barriers that divide us. Elena stood before the gathered crowd with Sophie beside her and tried to find words adequate to 5 generations of women choosing hard, right over easy wrong. I inherited this property homeless, living in my car. My siblings laughed because they thought wealth was measured in dollars. But Sarah taught me different. Maggie trusted me with that lesson. Wealth is keeping your word when it costs everything. Everything else is just metal in the ground. Sophie surprised everyone by stepping forward to speak. Her voice carried across the clearing with clarity that suggested Maggie's stubbornness had successfully jumped generations. Mom and I were homeless 6 months ago. We could live in a mansion now, but we're not because great-great-grandma Sarah taught us that some things are priceless. This mountain is priceless. Sarah's promise is priceless. And keeping your word when it costs you everything, that's priceless too. I'll teach my kids someday. That's what this family does. We keep promises. The ceremony ended with tribal blessing. Sage smoke rising into September sky, while elders sang prayers that predated European arrival by centuries. Even Daniel participated, awkward, but trying, which was more than Elena had dared hope. Later, as guests departed and sunset painted the mountains in shades that no photograph could capture, Elena stood with Sophie on the cabin's restored porch. Ruth joined them. Your grandmother would be proud. All of them would be. I hope so. Elena looked at the mountains holding their secrets. Sometimes I wonder if I made the right choice. Sophie could have had more if I'd mined the rest of the silver. Sophie leaned against her mother. We have enough, Mom, and we have something better. What's that, baby? We know who we are. We're the family that keeps promises. Nobody can take that away. The following Monday, Elena returned to Henderson High. The principal still seemed surprised to see her. You don't need to teach anymore. I know, but these kids need someone who believes they can make beautiful things even when the world tells them they're worthless. I'm qualified for that particular lesson. She walked into her classroom at 7:30 before the students arrived and stood at the window looking out at the parking lot where she'd once spent nights in her Honda. The car was gone now, sold to a student teacher who needed reliable transportation. In its place sat a sensible used Subaru. Nothing flashy, nothing that screamed money. Just dependable wheels for someone who'd learned the difference between what you own and who you are. Her students filed in at 7:50, 23 juniors who ranged from genuinely interested in art to deeply asleep. Elena launched into her lesson on perspective, demonstrating vanishing points, while her mind wandered to the mountains where Sarah Blackwood had carved a life from stone and kept a promise for 51 years, where Maggie had protected that promise for 70 more, where $30 million in silver still sat untouched because some covenants mattered more than any fortune. The pocket watch ticked in Elena's desk drawer, keeping time as it had for 158 years. Time reveals all truths, the inscription promised. And it had. It revealed that Daniel's success was hollow, that Catherine's achievements were empty, that Elena's homelessness had been the crucible that proved her worthy of trust that spanned generations. After school, Elena drove to the apartment where Sophie waited homework spread across a kitchen table that belonged to them. They ate dinner together, nothing fancy, just pasta and salad, and talked about Sophie's day and a math test coming up and whether butterflies really did migrate or just died and got replaced by new ones each spring. Normal conversation, normal life. The kind of evening Elena had dreamed about during 207 nights sleeping in a car. Later, after Sophie went to bed, Elena sat on their small balcony and looked at stars that were dimmed by city lights, but still visible if you knew where to look. She thought about Sarah dying in that cabin in 1918, having kept her word to Running Wolf despite every opportunity to break it. About Maggie visiting every few months for 70 years, protecting what wasn't hers to claim. About the choice both women had made: honor over wealth, covenant over comfort, promises over profit. And she thought about the lesson she would pass to Sophie, who would someday pass it to her own children. That some things were worth more than money, that your word was your wealth, that the truest inheritance wasn't property or silver or even love, but the understanding that character mattered more than anything the world could offer or take away. The mountain stood silent under stars, patient, impermanent, and utterly indifferent to human ambition. But somewhere in that indifference was a kind of wisdom. The stone didn't care who owned the deed or how much silver lay hidden in its depths. It simply existed, keeping its promises to gravity and time and the slow, patient work of geology. Elena could do worse than learn from mountains, could do worse than choose to be stone when the world demanded she be water, flexible and forgetting. Stone remembered. Stone endured. Stone kept its word across millennia. She went inside and locked the door and climbed into a bed that belonged to her in an apartment that no one could take away. And for the first time in 7 months, she fell asleep without counting money or checking locks or wondering if tomorrow would be the day everything fell apart. Because tomorrow she would teach art to ungrateful teenagers. Tomorrow Sophie would take her math test. Tomorrow the mountains would hold their silver and their secrets and their promises. And that was enough.